Today, we're going to be talking about user experience best practices. So in case you're unfamiliar with StartupSac, we are a nonprofit that focuses on helping entrepreneurs in the Sacramento region connect to the resources they need. And we do that by introducing them to other organizations who have programs, as well as sponsoring some programs on our own. So if you want to go check out after the seminar, go check out our website, startupsac.com. There's a lot of information that I think you will find useful. So as a nonprofit, we depend on the generosity of our sponsors, and our sponsors are, sorry, I gotta hide this window, Witten Law, SMUD, Bender Insurance Solutions, Nivagen, Stoll Reeve, Weintraub Tobin, Ernst & Young, Clifton Larson Allen, and Moneta Ventures. So thank you so much for your support and making these programs for entrepreneurs possible. So our presenter today, because I know you came to hear Mark and not so much to hear me, is Mark. We didn't practice your last name, but I'm going to say Tegtmeier. Did I get that? Did I do that? Okay?
Second T is silent.
Okay.
Yep.
Tegtmeier. Okay. He is the founder of Trailmerge, and I'll let Mark tell you a little bit more about himself and his practice. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and invite Mark to share his so we can get right into the meat of things.
All right, I'm going to pull this up here and we'll get started.
All right, we can see it, so you're good to go.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, it's super great being here with everybody. Actually connected with Laura probably a few years back at 1 Million Cups. We're both organizers of 1 Million Cups. I was organizer in Colorado Springs. So if you're familiar with that program, it's a great place, and you know that's happening in Sacramento as well. So give you a little background on myself and on Trailmerge before we dive in. So I've been in the user experience design field for a number of years. Came out of branding and design around branding. Started getting exposed to the startup community. I was actually in Bend, Oregon at the time, and really fell in love with the innovation that was happening. You know, I really kind of felt a pull and a call towards entrepreneurship for a number of years, and saw where user experience design could really match up and align design with the kind of entrepreneurial innovation and business problem solving that's involved in that process. So since then, I've had some really great opportunities to share about UX, TEDx, and mentoring folks. I was an instructor at General Assembly, so you might hear a little bit of kind of almost the classroom question and answer here as we go through, but really just love mentorship, which is kind of how Trailmerge became a thing. Started back in April of last year, and now we have a team of 4. And we're basically just helping startups, in particular in the software as a service space, with their UX design. So let's start here, some UX basics. First off, I want to open it up and you can write this down, respond in the chat. What do you think of when you hear the term UX before we get into some definitions here? So I'll let you take a couple minutes, just kind of, I know we've all heard the term UX because we're all here, but what comes to mind when you think of it?
I think of better appearance and functionality.
Appearance and functionality. Okay. Great.
I think in terms of whether it's easy enough for me that I want to come back and use the service again.
Yep. Ease of use.
I think of how my users or customers feel when they touch our product.
How they feel. Okay, so it's a perception and really kind of thinking from their mindset, their point of view. It's great. So I'm trying to find my chat. Speaking of UX, it's hiding. Let's see if anybody put anything in there.
Yeah, there's a couple.
Laura, would you prefer we write these things on chat instead of talking? What's easier for you and more?
What would you prefer, Mark?
I'm good either way. So
Okay.
yeah, it looks like okay. I'm seeing, but maybe actually let's do chat because then we'll give some opportunity to let everybody think through their answers and everything. Design users' digital experiences so it'll be easier for them to use the digital product. So there's another usability problem solving. That's definitely a huge part of the process. Interaction design, so how you actually interact with the interface of a software platform, for example. And UX could be outside of software as well, usually is associated with software, but it could be with services, physical products, things like that as well. So we'll dive into a couple definitions here. So this is Don Norman. So he and Jacob Nielsen are kind of the godfathers of the user experience design profession. And they say user experience encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. So it's even thinking beyond just the product itself. Typically, when we're talking about UX design in the software space, we're talking about specifically product design. But it could definitely encompass some other aspects of folks' interaction. I tried to stab at it. I am not one of the godfathers of the UX profession, but I threw together my take on it. Think of user experience design as the practice of crafting a product and or a service, so it could actually go together, in a way that centralizes people's interaction with and perception of said product or service. So what exactly does that mean? So when you think about the actual term itself, user experience design, you can't really design somebody's experience because experience has to do with perception, right? You can't really control somebody's perception, but you can influence it, right? So there are things that you can and cannot control. Things that you can't control are things like a user's context, their experience level with certain things, the device that they're using, a number of just contextual type factors, what they're used to, what they're not used to, things like that. What you can control is what the actual interface looks like. You can control how you're communicating, your side of communication, making sure that you're providing feedback to your users, things like that, so you can influence that perception that they get from the UI and the overall experience. UX is not the same as UI. Now, this is one thing that I see a lot. There's kind of this perception that UX design is about making things pretty. It can definitely be that. Aesthetic value is definitely part of UX designer skill set, but UX is taking that into account, but it's also thinking about the psychology of the user and the broader flows. It's architecting data and thinking about how somebody interacts with a piece of software. And it's really all about putting your users first. So obviously there's business considerations to keep in mind. There are technical constraints to keep in mind as well. But UX is really focused on representing the user and their needs and their desires and their preferences. So there's a lot that goes into UX. but these are the two high-level ingredients. You have research, so that could take the form of interviews, talking to your users. Steve Blank says, get out of the building, talk to your customers, right? So that's the research component. It's also actually putting prototypes or mock-ups in front of your users, having them go through steps of a process that's called usability testing to actually get feedback on things that you're currently building so you can change and iterate upon them. Then you have the UI and interaction side, the actual design of the software itself that should be influenced by what you're learning from your customers. Brian Chesky, founder of Airbnb, says we start with the perfect experience, then work backward. That's how we're going to continue to be successful. So they're a great example of a design-led company. They have design very baked into the mentality of who they are. So they actually brought in storyboard artists, I believe it was from Pixar, that would actually map out the full experience that somebody would go through as a host or as a guest at an Airbnb stay. And there's a lot of components to that interaction. It really starts when somebody's planning a trip, and it really it doesn't wrap up until you've gone and interacted with the host and all that kind of stuff. So this is one analogy I like to use a lot. UX is kind of like being an architect. So you wouldn't just basically go to a plot of land in downtown Sacramento and bring along your construction crew and say, hey guys, let's build something. Go ahead and build the skyscraper and everything's going to be awesome, right? You're going to need to have blueprints. You're going to need to have an architect come and figure out how that building is going to be used, how different parts of that building are going to be used, what are some of the different rooms, let's say. So like a lobby is going to be used different than a bathroom, for instance. So that'll reflect in the design. A few reasons why you should consider UX, especially if you're on your early stage of your startup. This is often a time where UX gets overlooked, but especially more and more as, especially looking at the SaaS world that I'm a little bit more familiar with. It's a very competitive market. So really UX becomes the differentiator oftentimes. It's not just the idea that's good enough to gain traction in the market. So one of the big things is product-led growth is something that's gaining more and more popularity. So basically letting the product drive sales and drive revenue for your company. And one major thing to be able to gain that kind of growth is easy adoption of your product. So if you have to support somebody along the way, through a support team, or maybe your founder is like guiding people to set up their accounts and things like that, there's obviously an obstacle there, barrier to entry. You want to create something that's very easily learnable. That's a big part of where user experience design comes in. Starting learning and selling more quickly. One really good example of this is I have a friend who started a company who basically put together some prototypes, and with just those prototypes started to approach potential customers, actually did some pre-sales that way, and ended up getting acquired pretty shortly. It wasn't a long process that he had his company, but he really focused on that learning, on that initial selling, getting that customer feedback very early on. UX allows you to do that in some short ways before you even get to actually building something out. So as you're learning, you want to control for your variables as well. So you think about, let's say you have a great idea that you think could really fit a particular industry very, very well. Well, if you don't see traction, you don't see adoption, it could be that the idea is just not something that the market's ready for. It's not something that really fits what your customers are looking for. But it can also be that the experience of your particular app is not what it needs to be, and maybe people are deleting the app off their phone, or they're churning simply because of the experience that's being offered. It's too hard to learn. It's too hard to integrate the tools that they need to integrate to get up to speed. It's too hard to get to the point where they're realizing the value that your product has to offer. So maybe that could be something that's actually contributing and giving you negative signals where the idea itself might actually be solid. We talked about differentiating in a crowded market. SaaS is growing like crazy. There are new SaaS companies coming out all the time. So thinking about just what is it that is going to be the reason that a client is going to choose you over somebody else? Ultimately, are they going to be able to achieve the goals that they're trying to achieve in a way that's easy, in a way that's quick, in a way that's efficient? UX plays in all that kind of stuff. One of the things with when you're going to development, I've seen this with several founders, they're kind of bootstrapping and trying to get together some very basic wireframes, very basic requirements, and getting those off to a dev team and saying, I want this feature, this feature, this feature. Now, when a developer is receiving that, it's kind of like that construction crew that we talked about with the skyscraper. You're basically saying, I like this idea, let's build this. But developers need to work off of requirements, off of blueprints. There's very few developers that I've met who are also good designers. They're typically more of the mindset of problem solving once they have a particular thing that they need to build. So that could cause problems in terms of how the product actually ends up being designed and the usability of it. It can also cause problems in terms of estimating costs because you're kind of just guessing. You don't really have very clear step-by-step, like this is what we're building. So the more detail that you can provide to a developer, the better estimates, the more accurate estimates that they can provide. Informed prioritization, this kind of goes back to research. Hearing from your customers is going to help you to actually make prioritization decisions of features that should go into your MVP, for example, based off of data. And it costs a lot less money, it costs a lot less time to get that information from your customers rather than just guessing and building and seeing, you're throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And then this last one, mitigate design debt. I'll mention it a little bit later on, but in our blog on trailmerge.com, we have an article on design debt. We'll get into that in a little bit of the details of what that is, but basically it's a lot easier to change the design of something early on in the process as you're going through the design phases, if you're going through kind of a proper UX process, than it would be if you start developing stuff and decide to change it later. All right, let's jump into the process now that we mentioned that. So teaching at General Assembly, it was almost every day I would put this double diamond up on the whiteboard. It's kind of the standard visualization of the UX process that is used in the UX profession. It's a little linear, a little more linear than it is in reality in some ways, but it gives a good foundation if you're starting to understand UX. So first off, you're kind of thinking from a more product perspective. You're trying to scope and really define that problem space that you're going to be working from. What are we trying to solve here? What is this feature going to include, or what is the MVP going to include? Just from a basic high level, what's the focus going to be? What are the customers saying? What is the market wanting? That kind of a thing. Now, from there, once you have that problem space, you'll go into that research phase, and it should be thinking about personas. Who are you specifically trying to solve problems for? And then what are those things that they're trying to accomplish? That's jobs to be done. I'll get into that in a little bit more in detail, but basically when a user downloads your application or they purchase a subscription or something like that, they have a particular goal that they're trying to achieve. And there are a lot of factors into that particular goal. Going into research with that kind of mindset, you can uncover a lot that you can actually use to then develop out your product. And there's a lot more methodologies on the research side. This is just a very basic kind of list. You can look up, and there's probably in the tens of different types of research methodologies that are used in UX. But this kind of beginning of the diamond, they're diamonds because they're you're gathering a lot of information at first, so there's a lot of data, and then you're paring down that data. You're making sense of that data over time and visualizing it. You're trying to sort down to what particular problem that we're hearing from customers are we going to solve with this particular design, and what are some of the things that we need to focus on with this design. Next, you're going to go into ideation. So you're going to do sketches. You're going to map out the flows that users are going to go through. You're going to start wireframing. So wireframing, I'll show you an example here in a second. It's basic, just not very super well defined. Typically is grayscale screen mockups. And then you're going further down the line, you're refining your ideas, usability testing, you're putting it in front of users, you're getting ideas from them, you're talking to your dev team, you're talking to your product team, and improving upon those ideas until you finally can get it ready for development, right? Those user stories, define requirements for your developers, and continue to learn from there. This is an example of kind of a mix of wireframes and flow map. So this was for one of our clients who's in the mortgage industry. This was very early on when he just had a concept. We helped him out with mapping out what his various dashboards and experience for loan officers would be. And when you're at this wireframe stage, your icons, for example, you could just use circles, or when you're going to put images somewhere, just put a rectangle, say this is going to be an image, right? You're not trying to get things very polished at this stage. This is about getting ideas. This is about getting the basic concepts visually in front of you, so then you can refine them and improve upon them. And then you're going into further annotated mockups. A little zoomed out here, but this is much further on the line when you're starting to get ready for development. Your designs are starting to get polished up. All these little blue, bright blue things next to the screens, those are annotations. So we're basically pointing out different parts of the design and saying, this should interact with this way. If you click on this button, it should do this thing. Or if this is where this data should come from to populate this particular screen. So what's next for you? Now, it really depends. Like when you're looking at that overall process, again, that process is not always linear. Sometimes you're skipping back and forth between them. It really kind of depends on where you're at right now and what circumstance you're in. But let's take a couple minutes here. And again, let's go to the chat with this. What steps have you done in that UX process? I put that down at the bottom, some of the steps that we discussed earlier. Which ones have you missed that you think could be useful for your particular product? And what's next for your product? Considering the things that you've done, the things that you might have missed, and considering where you are in terms of your product lifecycle. What's next? So I'll let y'all take a couple minutes for that. Just throw some things in the chat.
We need that Jeopardy music.
Yeah.
While everyone's thinking of their answer.
Yeah, and there's when it comes to research, there's a lot of other potentials that you could do. Some things could be researching. Say you go onto a review site, you could look at what people are saying about other products in your industry, what pain points they're having, what features are beneficial for them, what are the reasons that they're buying for. I see someone say in the chat, I've taken courses on Coursera to practice usability testing and wireframe drafting. Awesome. Yeah, and usability testing is something that I definitely would always recommend, especially as you're developing out workflows, onboarding workflows. If your app involves building some sort of either something that you're designing in the app or something that you're filling out, kind of a form that's a stepped process, things like that. It's amazing sometimes how much users can either kind of get derailed based off even just how something is worded. So usability testing can really help with that. App built through alpha testing needs more gamification stickiness. Yeah, 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 and usability testing can be great for understanding what features are really standing out to folks as well. What's going to continue building adoption. Startup I'm working for needs to take requirements with wireframe and testing them. They directly built it and are now struggling with technical debt. Yeah, that's a pretty common scenario. I've definitely encountered that. So a good thing to do in that case might be taking some of the feedback that you're getting from users and seeing what some of the highest areas, the highest pain point areas are through dev and now live. Lots of testing on the go with then beta users, now paying users. Users are complimentary of the experience, but I always feel like I'm missing something. Is there a way for me to test the experience and identify things my users may not see or think of? Now, one thing with usability testing that I think is a little bit different from the feedback that you would typically receive either through support or let's say you're putting out surveys and trying to understand how the experience is for your users through that. One thing with usability testing is you're actually taking a task and you're observing them go through that task process. And something that we always ask is for our participants to think out loud. So in other words, don't just think it in your head, actually say what you're thinking as you're going through this process. Why are you going up to this corner? What's making you think to click on this versus clicking on this, which we intended? So there are little things like that if you're actually observing somebody go through your designs, you'll catch things that are blocking their experience that you wouldn't typically catch if they're just volunteering the information. And then is there a blueprint or game plan I can do for that? Yes, actually Nielsen Norman has some great resources on usability testing if you're going to do some there. And then trying to think what that, there's another resource. I'll have to think about it. That would be good. Rocket surgery. This was called something about rocket surgery. It talks about usability testing by Steve Krug. Okay, all right, we'll get into some life hacks. So wanted to give you all some things that you could easily implement into where you're at in your product right now. First thing, know your user. And hint, that's not you. So it's not about you. It's a little tough love. So one of the things about design is a lot of times it's super easy to get in this mindset. Let's say you've come from a particular industry and you're like, yeah, I know I've seen this pain point. A couple of people I've talked to that I work with also have the same pain point. But the thing is, you're not actually going and talking to other people outside your immediate circle. So you might be experiencing something in your particular company, in your particular context, that is maybe not the biggest pain point for a lot of other folks. So you want to really understand who that user is, and especially the more and more that you start working on your product, you're further and further removed from that end user because you're so close up and personal with your own product that it's going to be really difficult to take an objective look back. Yeah. Yes, and founders who get that early on will save lots of money on development and redevelopments. Laura pointed out in the chat. So yes, that is very, very true. You can get into some really I've seen this way too much where folks are just like so confident. No, I get it. Don't worry, I get it. Like, oh, let's test that. What's going to hurt? There's a very minimal cost to actually talk to your customers versus to actually just kind of go all in and build out what you think is going to be a good idea. All right, number 2, design a product that a few people love, not the one that a lot of people like. So it's so common, and this kind of just goes with business in general, but in particular product design, that if you're trying to be all things to all people, you're probably not going to satisfy really anybody. I like thinking of this in terms of the NPS survey. So if you're familiar with this, NPS is Net Promoter Score. So if you are really trying to attract kind of that broad audience, you're going to get a lot of these 5s and 6s. And the issue with that is a lot of times you'll get kind of high churn in that kind of a situation. Your detractors are really who the folks who put together the NPS determined are those who will actually go and say bad things about your product. So even if you're saying like kind of what you think would be a neutral score of how likely you are to recommend something, you actually might be much more likely if you're even a 6 to say something like that you're frustrated about because you're tepid. And it's really those 9s and 10s, those people who are really excited, who are going to be evangelists for your product and who are going to help you to really build something important and something that gains a lot of traction. So it's not that you stay with those particular, just those 9s and 10s, but if you can really hone in on solving this problem set, it's likely that you'll also solve for other people's things that they're facing as well in a very effective way. So let's take a few minutes here. Let's put in the chat, how might you refine who you're designing for? So that could be thinking about your persona. Do you have a well-defined person? And I do think, so I see in the chat, but investors don't necessarily think that way. That might be to an extent. I would say, as soon as you start gaining traction, because you've seen that. So it might be a little bit longer process in the front end, but the traction, you have a little bit more potential because you won't be quite losing as many folks. But how might you refine who you're designing for? So what particular problem set, what's the role that this person's in? What is the life situation that they're in? One thing about personas, sometimes they get very, if you're thinking more from a marketing point of view, a lot of time looking at demographic information, like age, gender, things like that. A lot of times that's really not important for product design, because you're really looking more at what somebody's job is that they're trying to accomplish. So a job, just to clarify, is not necessarily something that you do in the workplace. It could be, a job could be, I want to feel better about myself, or I want to interact with my friends over, say, shared interest in music or something like that. I see a question related to this with detailed description of media and consumption habits. Not necessarily. I mean, it depends on what your product is. If your product is related to media and it's consumer-based application, then those might be important. But let's say it's an app for sales teams. Well, it's not really going to matter so much what your favorite news channel is or what music you listen to. It's going to be more about what you're trying to accomplish in the workplace. All right. Go ahead and move on to questions. So this is going back into that research phase. It's great to do research. It's great to talk to your customers, but you have to ask the right questions. So some examples of you know, a lot of times I'll talk to founders and say, oh yeah, I've talked to my customers. And then you start hearing the kind of questions that they're asking their customers. And that makes a huge difference. So for example, do you like this idea? Would you use this? Now, those are bad questions for this reason, because they're yes/no questions, and they typically lead somebody to an answer, right? So if you say to somebody, do you like this idea? What are they going to say most of the time? Say, oh, yeah. Well, okay, does yeah mean you actually like it, or does that mean that you are just trying to make me not feel bad, or you're trying to save face because you don't want to be like the grumpy friend or something like that? You want to be that encouraging presence in my life, even though the idea in reality is terrible and you would never spend money on it, or you would never spend your time on it. So instead, you can ask, you frame the question a little bit differently to leave it more open-ended. How do you feel about this idea? Right? Because then you're talking about, you could be talking about a wide range of opinions and feelings. You could say, you know, honestly, I'm a little confused by it. You know, so it's not necessarily like a yes, no. There are some nuances that you can start to capture. And then one of the things with, would you use this? If we did this, if we added this feature, would you download this app? Would you purchase the subscription? Those are not great questions because they're speculative. So the data that you're going to get from them is going to be speculative, right? If you talk about what have you used in the last year, you're talking about behaviors. You're talking about things that have actually happened. So with that, you can actually say like, this is reality. This is not just some potential. You know, think about, do you know what you're going to buy in a year from now? Or do you know what you're going to do in detail 6 months from now? You likely don't, right? We don't typically plan out our lives like that. So anytime that we're talking about would I you know, purchase this, would I download this, would I use this more often, things like that, we honestly just don't know. So looking at past behavioral data is much more reliable. And then what about, isn't this great? So that kind of goes along with that same thing. It's leading, it's kind of a more of a sales type question where you're trying to arrive at a particular answer. But if you're actually doing more, you're trying to get reliable product market fit type data, that's not going to lead you to the answers that you need. Some other great questions, just to keep things open-ended, would be anything that starts with who, when, where. You're trying to get the context, you're trying to get a bigger understanding of the user's environment and what they're going through, what their situation is, what their motivations are, things like that. On a scale of 1 to 5, so this could be something that using in usability testing, for example. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being, you know, super clear and 5 being super confusing. How was this process for you? Or say on a scale of 1 to 5, how important is X to you? Right? Clarifying questions are always good. So follow-up questions, this is one of the things I really like to advocate, you know, because you could do usability testing that is non-moderated, unmoderated usability testing, where you are not there present. I really like moderated testing because you can ask those follow-up questions and gain a ton of helpful information just by saying, okay, what did you mean when you said this? Or when you went there, why did you do that? What was the thinking there? And then asking why, of course. You can uncover a lot of information, which is why my kids ask me that question all the time. All right, we'll dive into jobs to be done. I mentioned a couple times, it's really about what users are trying to accomplish. The classic analogy is that people don't purchase a drill because they want a drill. They purchase a drill because they want a 1/4-inch hole. So think about those motivations. What is somebody opening up your platform to accomplish? Right? There's always some sort of a goal, even if it is just I want to reconnect with my friends back home or things like that. That's also a job. And they correlate pretty well with some of these question words that we're talking about. Context. Where are you when you request an Uber ride, let's say? Or what time of day is it? You know, you might need to design a little bit different interface based on if it's night versus if it's the middle of the day, right? Maybe you think about dark modes and things like that. Behaviors. Behaviors, this is looking at those past behaviors. How have you tried to accomplish this goal in the past? What kinds of solutions are you using right now to do this particular thing? Motivations, pain points, those are your areas of opportunity right there. What kind of issues are you facing when you're trying to, you know, do your payroll? And what defines success? So let's take a couple minutes, throw these in the chat. And Laura had a great point. Maybe don't ask your friends, ask people you don't know. Yes, your friends will tend to be a little biased towards you. And you want to find people who are going to tell you the hard truth. So let's go into this. Right, one non-leading question to learn about your users' jobs to be done. So it could be related to context, behaviors, pain points, the success metrics around those jobs. And let's see a few in the chat here. What's your biggest headache at work? Yep. Yeah, and a question like that is going to be really good if you have a specific kind of role that you're speaking to. So if let's say you're creating a sales platform, you're talking to sales folks. What's your biggest headache at work? It's going to be a little bit different than if you're just asking kind of a general audience. All right, what's your biggest headache when scheduling a meeting? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. And you know, thinking about the context, who's on your team? Who do you report to? What are some of the kind of main things that your job performance is measured by? How do you communicate success to your supervisors? Awesome. Cool. All right, let's move on to number 5. Let's keep the feedback cycle tight. And I see, what annoys you most when doing that? Yep, that's another good question. What's been your best experience with this type of product? Mm-hmm. Yep, getting an idea of what the competition has been doing well is a really good, information to gather, not just what they've been doing poorly, because you don't want to just completely throw out everything that the competitors doing well. You want to learn from that as well as learning from what they're not doing so well. Yeah. All right, let's go on to number 5 here. Keep the feedback cycle tight. So focus on your learning and customer input. So I put together a blog that's related to MVP and how we typically think of MVP. It's kind of like just version 1. We're just gonna get it out there and it's gonna be scrappy and it's gonna be all that kind of stuff. Well, it might not necessarily even need to be something that is fully developed out, right? MVP is really about something that you can learn from initially. So keeping that iterative cycle very tight in terms of just putting something out every so often in greater frequency is going to mean that you're going to have more feedback from your users. You're going to be able to work smarter and not have these long wish lists that you're developing out, and half of the things, let's say, your customers don't actually want. Start low fidelity. So this is kind of related to keeping that feedback cycle tight. Iterating when you just have wireframes is going to be a lot less expensive than iterating when you have a fully developed feature. And this goes into the design debt topic. So this is something that we put together that's in that blog post about design debt that's on our website, trailmerge.com. When you are first just gathering those requirements, you're doing research initially, you're doing those early wireframes, you're doing usability testing, there's not a lot of cost associated with making changes to that design or to that direction that you're taking with your product. But as soon as you start getting into development, your cost goes up significantly. And then you actually launch it, you're starting to build a reputation, your brand is affected by changes that you make or by things that you did not take into consideration earlier on. And those redesigns, the level of support that you have to offer your customers, that can be a significant cost. And then of course, all the training that you need to do. So if your support team and your sales team, your marketing team need to understand the product that you have actually put out there, that takes time and energy and effort as well. So they're going to have to relearn the more that you change at that point. And then looking at the bottom here, this is thinking about in terms of people, who's involved in the process over time. All right, this is going more into the design diamond, talking about design system. This is something that I see people talking more and more about recently. It's something that we do quite a bit for our clients that we work with, is helping them to build out a design system. And design system is about three main things: learnability, which goes along with consistency. It's keeping, yes, brand consistency, aesthetic consistency, but also consistency in terms of how interactions work in your product. So what happens when you fill out a form? How do the different inputs interact? What can people be used to in terms of how the buttons interact or where things are laid out? And they could be in different parts of your application, and they can expect something similar. So at that point, you can pick up new features quite a bit easier than if every one of them is a little bit disparate. So there's actually a philosophy in terms of how interactions play out and standards around interactions that go into a design system as well. And of course, speed. So when you are building out a design system, you're actually defining components. So if you're using something like React, you're creating different components. And this is looking at kind of the base level, your colors, your typography, your icons, getting into input styles, things like that. This is from a couple of the different design systems that we've built, a little sampling. But you're actually building out larger components, more complex components than this as well. So let's say you use the same kind of card style with the same kind of headline and the same kind of text and things like that, and maybe a profile photo or something like that. You use those in different parts of your application. You're building that once, then you can put it throughout different designs that you're building. You can easily build it out into different areas of your app that your developers are building. So there's a speed component to it as well. This is obviously a part of the design system side, but learnability can be bigger than just consistency. So just a simple way of saying, I see in the chat here, website or app color choices for buttons, etc., really impacts my joy in using the product. There's definitely this light side to UX that you can take into consideration. It's important to take into consideration. I think apps like Asana do a really good job of it. Something else that Asana does a great job with here is with this learnability piece. Now you could guide people along by having a lot of text and instructions and all that kind of stuff. This is what you see when you create a new project board in Asana. They give you a few columns already, so they're ready for you. And they give you one sample task card. Now, with that, you already know some of the basics of what you can do on the screen. You don't need instructions. You can see that there's a task. You can see that right underneath it, you can add another one of those. That's what it's going to look like. You know what to expect. Same thing with these sections, these columns. And you already see the check marks. There's a lot of kind of subtle hints just in this initial screen where you can pick up the product very easily. Prevent errors before they happen. This is kind of maybe the other end of learnability. So there are applications where you let people just go and they're going to run into all these brick walls of errors, right? But the more that you can make it hard to break stuff, the better. I had a developer that I worked with when I was doing more kind of website design and some front end development. And he said, if you can break this, then I'm not doing my job. So it's kind of something along those lines when it comes to design as well. If you're just going to get thrown all these different errors, then I'm not doing my job as a designer to help guide you along the process. Think about a form, for example. Instead of having required, and then throwing all these errors when you hit the submit button, what if you actually disable that button, right? Until you have all those fields that are required filled in, and then that lights up for you. Or little hints like that. There's a lot of things that you can do to just kind of, if you have the mindset of I'm going to prevent errors so people are not running into them, then you can prevent a lot of frustration that typically comes. The opposite of that would be, you come to the bottom of a form, you hit a button, you don't see any error at all, and you have to like scroll up the page and find the wrong input, where you put in your phone number wrong because it didn't like that you put in parentheses or something like that. So that's obviously the other side of you actually don't want that. All right, so let's take a few minutes here. Again, what can you do to make your platform easier to learn? Base it on interfaces or experiences that they're already familiar with. Yeah, that's super important. Have you fix it. Sounds good. Would not like Microsoft, Bob. Yeah, the point about basing it on interfaces or experience that people are already familiar with is super important. There's a design standard that Niels and Norman have that's relating things to the real world. Part of the real world is actually the standards that we are used to and conventions that we've used in other platforms, right? Trying to be too innovative in UX design is actually really a bad idea, because then you're having to guess. There's that, you lose that learnability. If you're using standard design practices, the logo on the top left-hand corner, for example, that takes you back to the homepage. That's a simple standard that people are very used to. That if you incorporate that, that already enhances the learnability, because at that point they're not having to learn something new. Yeah, I see this comment about, it took me a while to get used to the hamburger, but now I expect it. I have ideas about hamburger. My GA students knew how I would feel about hamburgers if they used them. Just say that. Seems to have been replaced by the vertical stack of 3 dots. Yeah. Dashboards must contain all the important things and link the user's needs for its tasks. Yeah, that's a great point. Linking information with what you can do with that information is, really takes dashboards kind of to the next level. It's not just about consuming information. Yeah, that's good. Designing for the 70+ set is difficult. You're talking age? Not just in terms of, okay, so 70 plus age range, not just in terms of size of font. Yes. So, what you're familiar with, right? As a millennial, there's a certain amount of things that I've actually grown up with and am used to because I've grown up with technology, versus if a lot of your life you haven't been interacting with web applications. Business has been done in a different way. I mean, it's obviously a generalization, but so it is a different mindset when you talk about different generations. If you had computers, but they used DOS, yes. They still do in some retail environments that I've walked in, and I see, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's great. All right. And lastly, and I would say really most importantly, is humanizing users. So we're designing for people, right? We're not designing for computers. You see all this technical language that's used in UIs, typically when the developers have built it. It becomes difficult to understand, things like that. The other aspect of humanizing users is, unfortunately, users have become somewhat of a commodity to be manipulated. And somebody asked earlier in the chat about dark patterns. I do not like dark patterns. I find them manipulative or passive aggressive, and really not humanizing users. It's not putting users first, right? So I really don't appreciate some of the things that, for instance, Amazon would do. So for example, this particular payment plans here on the right side, your options for this, I think it's an annual subscription versus the monthly subscription. The options are yes, take the offer, or no, I don't like savings. Right? It's called confirm shaming is the term for that. I put the reference here at darkpatterns.org. They have a lot of really good information about these UI patterns that are manipulative or really just trying to take advantage of confusion. You see it a lot with like discount airlines, for example, or I remember Vistaprint, several years ago, they'd always put the stuff in your cart and then you have to like take it out of your cart. Instead of them asking if you want it, you just buy it without realizing, things like that. So the more that you can give folks choice and freedom and things like that, I'm definitely an advocate for that. I think it's just taking care of people. So if you're doing design, there's a lot of power that you have in your hands. We obviously want to use the power that we have for good and making the world a better place. All right, next steps. So just some basics in terms of building a UX strategy. Where are you now? Think about that. What is the ideal experience? So even just thinking kind of that long term, kind of what Brian Chesky was saying that earlier slide, working back from that ideal experience, learning and using the process and help you get there, understanding your customers, putting them at the center of kind of that whole process. And then think about prioritization. So now, next, and future, it's a good way to frame that. What's important now? So look at those kind of really highly, just those really difficult parts of your application, or the parts that are high friction. Those are probably the things to focus on now. There'll be things to improve next, and there'll be those nice to haves that can come in the future. The future will always change because you're going to be continuing to hear from customers. So again, don't hold your plans lightly when it comes to building a product. A couple quick notes here. I mentioned this a couple times, this design debt piece that we put on the blog. We also put some things more recently in terms of prioritizing features and all the choices and data points that go into that. So check that out. it doesn't really cover all of it because there's so much into that's really kind of the whole product management profession, but it's kind of an overview there. And then one other thing, we have SaaS design audits that we've been doing for a few different companies. We kind of recently started doing these, but basically what we're doing is we're looking at specific points of your application, pinpointing areas of improvement. So if you have something that's out there, something, even if it's kind of early designs, mock-up prototypes, but really ideally, if you have something that's in a production or a development environment, we would go in there and basically identify what are the points that could improve usability in these different verticals. So check that out. And I'll go ahead and open for questions.
And for this question part, if people want to raise their hand, their Zoom hand, I could call on them, or you could let us know in the chat that you have a question. So whichever method you'd like to use. So come on, who's got a question? I know you've got them. Well, oh, Jeff's got a question.
Well, so I will defer to anybody else who has a question first. Terry just typed in, how do we can contact you? So maybe type your contact information there. But I thought an easy one might be, we're all using the same interface right now. So Mark, maybe talk about what are the most annoying or frustrating or flaws of the Zoom interface?
Yeah. Well, so I was having a hard time finding the chat in the middle of this call, so that's one. Let's put that out there. But no, I think Zoom, relative to some other video products, has done an overall better job. One of the things that I've had a lot of hard times with recently has been Google Meet. So when folks want to use that, I'm a little nervous, mainly because it just kind of hides out in this tab in your browser. Right. So actually going back to it when you're screen sharing, when you're looking at other things in your conversations that you're having, things like that, that is, it's a little bit rough. I'm looking around for where my Zoom is at when I'm on a Google Meet call.
Yeah. What would be an example of, say, an app that a lot of people use that, you might hold out as kind of a benchmark for good UX?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do like Asana quite a bit. They've really focused on a particular problem space and done a great job at it. Another one that, unless you've been doing some of the UI design, you might not be as familiar with, but Figma is a great tool. We use it for most of the work that we do, and they've just really hit the nail on the head. So like what they're doing. Versus a Sketch or Adobe XD that I've used in the past, and I think they have some great things to them, but Figma seems to have really unified the experience and made a really great collaborative platform. So,
well, and I'd say I like Canva over Adobe. What's the Adobe one called, Jeff?
Well, Illustrator or Photoshop. Illustrator's a tough one to.
Because I think Canvas really solved a problem when Adobe is such a powerful tool. Any of the Adobe products, Illustrator, Photoshop, they're powerful tools. But if you're really just kind of putting together some social media posts, you don't need that level of power. So simplifying that is really helping people achieve the jobs that they're trying to accomplish.
So Joe has a question for you in the chat.
Yeah, do you offer some sort of independent audit service to review existing app UX? Yes. So that's the one was mentioned earlier with what we do is prioritize the what are the main blockers versus what's something that's a little bit more of an annoyance. So we actually put them on a scale of 1 to 5, things like that. Yes, we do. So definitely reach out to it as at the hello@trailmerge.com email address for that. Awesome. Let's see. We're doing a B2B software writing manuals, which I think is outdated. If you are doing an agile approach, which I think is really ideal for learning and getting things out to customers as soon as possible, manuals are going to be hard to keep up. And yeah, I think there definitely is kind of an indicator. If you have to have a manual in order for somebody to learn your product, that's probably an indicator that the learnability could use some improvement.
All right, we got some other questions for Mark.
Mark, wondering if you have any resources, books that you might recommend. I know you mentioned Steve Krug earlier. I read his Don't Make Me Think ages and ages ago. Is he coming out with anything more recent about software platforms, apps, stuff like that?
Yeah, I haven't kept up as much with him. Some of the other classic, so the one that you mentioned is kind of one of the foundational UX books that's awesome to read. Another one is Design of Everyday Things. That's kind of, it's a little bit thicker in terms of the language and everything, but it's very thorough, and it's kind of standard text of UX. So definitely recommend that.
That's quite a URL you just posted there, Jeff.
Yeah, well, it's Amazon for you. And I'm gonna, this one will be better. This is the Design of Everyday Things link I'm gonna put in there.
Yeah. So Mark, when I first started learning about kind of the career field of UX, I organized an event where it was like 4 women who had UX careers. And I was really surprised to find out that most of them didn't have, any kind of software background or even necessarily like anything art or design related, that they were sociologists and psychologists and things of that nature. So I always found that interesting. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, or if you've seen that, or if that is, now that's old and now there's people who went to school to be UX type things.
Yeah, no, I would actually say that is still a very current situation in UX, is that there are a lot of career changers. So I myself got a degree in Latin American studies. So it's basically a Spanish major with some history thrown in, and a little bit of sociology and stuff like that. So it is very common that people are coming from kind of that liberal arts or psychology, sociology type background, which fits very well into especially the research component of UX. I think you do see a little bit more where people are getting human-computer interaction degrees, HCI degrees, which are, not a lot of schools have a UX degree, but that's pretty much the closest thing that there is to one in most places. But for the most part, honestly, most of the UX professionals that I know, some of them are even just from very different backgrounds. Having worked at Home Depot, I met people who previously worked in like marine biology or worked at the aquarium, or were, I think our UX director had a previous life in bartending. So and he switched careers into tech and into UX, and is now running a very successful UX practice at the Home Depot. So yeah, people come from all sorts of different backgrounds.
All right, so Stephanie's got a question there. What skill set do you think is, it looks like we got cut off, is what, Stephanie? Maybe what important for UX, okay.
Yeah, that's great. I would say one of the really basic skill sets that is actually sometimes hard to come by is active listening. Active listening is super important. But it's really kind of a multifaceted discipline in that you have that research component, which you want to understand things almost from a scientific method type framework, where you have your hypotheses, you're testing those hypotheses, you're revising your theories and stuff based off of that. So you have that aspect of it. Then you also have the visual component. For most UX design roles out there have to do with the visual UI. That's not entirely the case. You know, if you're working on Alexa, for example, you're working with an audio UI and conversational UI. So there are other types of UIs out there, but for the most part, I think that visual component is definitely important. You know, especially, but there's also the aspect of understanding kind of systems flows and how people interact with things. So for example, you know, folks who are coming in from a architecture type background, where they're working with physical spaces, they have a lot of those skill sets that can fit really well into UX as well. So I think that's where you see people coming from all sorts of different backgrounds. They'll have a little bit of different emphasis, and yeah.
Kitchen design would be a high value for UX, I think.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Along those lines, I'm wondering if there's any upcoming emerging technology trends that people might want to pay attention to that are driving, that'll drive UX design. Like I'm thinking about the growth of augmented reality and how that's going to change how we interact with our phones and with the space all around us.
Yeah. Augmented reality is interesting. There's definitely some applications that I've been seeing more so. So, you know, for instance, I'm in the interior design market, for example. You're buying furniture and you're seeing it in your room, that kind of thing. So that kind of thing is pretty cool. But honestly, probably what I'm seeing a little bit more so is a leaning towards data. And it could just be that I'm in a lot more B2B context. But there are so many complexities around working with data that go into actually how something's designed. Really kind of one main project that I've been working on for last couple of years. It's been kind of surprising to me how much I've been getting into math and like statistics, trying to remember stuff from my like community college statistics course and stuff. That's really impacting how this design you know, could work. So as you're working with data heavy applications, you know, there's a lot to organizing that kind of information and making it consumable to your users.
Thanks.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat. Terry wants to know if you're based in Sacramento, so I'll let you answer that.
All right, so I have a little hint here of where I'm at. I'm just outside Atlantic, Georgia. Actually went to high school the other side of the Golden State, down in San Diego area. But yeah, now the opposite coast.
Yeah, and your clients are all over North America, right?
Yeah, right now we have a few in Atlanta and another in the Midwest. But yeah, definitely, you know, everything's virtual. We're actually fully distributed. So I'm here in Atlanta. We have a designer in Charleston, in Orlando. Victoria's up in Ohio. So we're definitely very used to working virtually, as we all are now.
Okay, and then Gary says, can an app have a learning algorithm to help minimize the UI?
Might need a little more context on that question.
Do you want to ask it, Gary? You can unmute yourself and give some context there.
Absolutely. Hey, Mark.
Hey.
This would come off of Elon Musk's latest little blurb on, on his car. And the app interface, the car needs to learn your habits and then react accordingly. So you're not telling it to do anything, minimizing the user interface.
Yeah.
That type of user interface, I mean, I'm going to have a couple different within our whole concept of our company, but that's a main one for the product. And I don't necessarily want an app for our product, but you have to have one. So you have one, but it should be just running in the background. In other words, it really shouldn't be. The ultimate goal would be there is no user interface.
Yeah.
It just works. It just knows what you want. It just does what you do out of habit. And if you need to introduce something new, you can do so. But that you'll do it once, maybe 3 times to set a pattern.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So there was a talk that I was at few years back that had to do with the best UI is no UI, kind of along those lines, right? So as if you can minimize the information that a user actually has to input into a system, or you can take the information that the system already has and help minimize those steps, that's a better user experience, right? So I definitely think there is some component of where things are moving that way. I do think that there's always going to have to be some sort of a human element to it, because a computer can make guesses, a computer can make very, very, very well educated guesses, but at the end of the day, we as humans are somewhat unpredictable. Even if you can try to predict us as much as you possibly can, you always want to have some level of control and freedom that you give to users as well.
Looks like
All right.
Stephanie had a question there.
So do you want to ask it, Stephanie? Okay.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Well, yes, I just started as a UX designer, and I'm the only designer, and it's more or less also a startup. So everybody's kind of new and doesn't have that much experience yet. So for me, it's really hard. So I do get the research part and stuff quite good, but for me, it's a challenge to get the UI right. So it's I'm kind of struggling or missing out that somebody gives me feedback or helps me just improve the UI. And also because I'm doing software, I feel that there are not so many examples online to like, yeah.
Yeah, versus like if you were doing, say, web design or something like that, and there's, it's all over Dribble.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it definitely is important to connect with kind of a broader community of UX designers. If you reach out to us, I'd be happy to connect you with a couple communities that we're a part of.
Wow, great. That's a great offer. Thanks.
And then Joe gives an example. He says the Commonwealth of Massachusetts went after Robinhood for having confetti appear after the user executed a trade via the app. Sad but true. Remind me never to move to Massachusetts.
Yeah, their argument was it was just sort of something not addictive, because it's a strong word, but basically it invited people to do more trades and maybe not think through the consequences of the investment. I'm not here to support that argument, but and I think that's maybe a very sort of extreme example, but definitely want to be cognizant of how these things work, especially in regulated markets like financial services. So I'm a big fan of confetti, but I certainly don't want to see anybody get in trouble for digital confetti.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's interesting. The world of design ethics is definitely something that people are more and more discussing, and I think there's a lot of trying to figure out where those lines are. Obviously, I think that's probably a little bit over, but those are definitely important conversations that need to be continued to have among the design community.
So we've got a question from Juan. Juan, do you want to go ahead and ask it?
Yeah. Hey, Mark, thank you for the presentation. I've been doing UX once the iPhone app came out, but haven't really focused on it lately because I'm running a startup. But how do you keep updated with trends, technology, and design? Because it's always changing with new designs, new experience, new technology, and I want to keep updated. So is there something you go to or anything like that to get new stuff?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And trends are kind of an interesting thing in the world of UX, just because of that kind of the whole idea of, how much do you want to keep things familiar versus how much do you want to innovate on them, right? So it's kind of like being in that spectrum. So I try not to be overly conscious of trends in some ways, but I do try to keep up with kind of what's going on. So Slack communities are a great way to do that. There's several design related Slack communities where people share content and things like that. am on a few different email subscriptions. So like Nielsen Norman Group, I'm on their email list, and trying to think who else. There's a kind of more user research related one out of was it Measuring You, I believe it's called Measuring You, based out of Denver, and I think they have an office in Milan or something. But those can be really good things to follow, just to get ideas, not only from like a visual side, but also from a what's going on in terms of what kind of research is being done on almost the more academic side of user research, to understand what methodologies are effective, what's not.
To talk about user research, I've used user testing before, which is, what do you feel about that, and other resources to get to do that user research through software or websites?
Yeah, I've not used user research. I've used a tool called Lookback in the past. We actually moved from Lookback because they were pretty expensive per user, to actually just using Zoom and recording on Zoom. And one other tool that has been very helpful has been actually on the recruiting side, a site called User Interviews. They basically recruit, and you can specify like what kind of job titles you're looking for and other demographic information that's going to fit your persona. So if you're looking to usability test or conduct user interviews with a particular demographic, that can be super helpful. It definitely saves a lot of time from trying to recruit people through LinkedIn and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it takes time. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Mark, I'd say maybe reading your blog is a good way to keep up on trends, right?
Yes, definitely. Please do. Yeah, and actually with that, if you reach out to us at that hello email address, and just drop us your email, say you're interested in signing up for our newsletter, we'll push those out as well. So.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up here. Thank you so much, Mark, for doing such a wonderful job.